Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. The harbor still smelled of burning oil and scorched steel when Admiral Chester Nimitz stepped ashore on Christmas Day, summoned from Washington to assume command of what remained of the United States Pacific Fleet. He stood at the waterfront in the early morning and looked at the wreckage without speaking. The battleship Arizona rested on the harbor bottom with more than 1,100 men still inside her. The Oklahoma had capsized, her hull rising above the waterline like the belly of a beached whale. The West Virginia and the California had settled into the mud at their moorings. 2,403 Americans were dead, and the surface battle fleet that American doctrine had built for 2 decades as the primary instrument of Pacific naval power had been destroyed in 90 minutes on a Sunday morning. The officers watching Nimitz walk the waterfront that day were reading him for some sign of what kind of commander had arrived. They watched a man who did not linger at the wreckage. He turned from it and began asking questions. Not about the losses, about what still worked, about who the intelligence officers were, about what the code-breaking teams in the basement on Makalapa Drive had been learning from Japanese radio traffic since the attack. What remained, when the full accounting was made, was thin. 3 aircraft carriers, a submarine force working through a batch of torpedoes with defective detonators, a collection of cruisers and destroyers, no battleships capable of open ocean combat. Against the Imperial Japanese Navy, which had swept from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean in 6 months without losing a fleet carrier, it was not enough. If this story is pulling you in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who's listening. In Tokyo, and aboard the super battleship Yamato, riding at anchor in Hashirajima Bay, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had spent the winter of 1941 and in 1942 designing what he believed would be the decisive blow. He did not share the confident expansionism of colleagues who assumed the string of Japanese victories could continue indefinitely on momentum alone. Yamamoto had lived in America. He had studied at Harvard Law School and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had observed the industrial interior of the country at close range, seen its steel capacity and its factory floors, and held in his head a private calculation that he shared selectively, and that none of his enthusiasm for the first phase of the Pacific War could make him abandon. His window for securing a negotiated peace from a position of overwhelming strength was not years. He had spoken of it, in correspondence with colleagues who had asked, in months. Operation MI was built on this urgency. The target was Midway Atoll, a pair of flat coral islands sitting 1,100 miles northwest of Honolulu in the Central Pacific. The islands together covered less than 3 square miles of dry ground. Their strategic value was a different measure. Midway's airfield put Japanese bombers within striking range of Pearl Harbor itself. Its capture would press a loaded weapon against the throat of the American base complex that had survived December 7th and was now beginning to function as the staging platform for every American operation in the theater. More to the point, Yamamoto understood that seizing Midway would leave Nimitz no viable choice. He would have to send whatever carriers remained to contest it, or accept that Japan held a position from which American territory could be struck at will. Yamamoto intended to be waiting with the full weight of the combined fleet when those carriers arrived. The American carrier force would be located and destroyed. The Pacific War would end before American industrial production changed the mathematics enough to matter. The confidence behind this calculation was not built on empty arrogance. By May of 1942, the operational record gave Yamamoto solid reasons for it. His carrier air groups had struck Pearl Harbor, Ceylon, and the Coral Sea across 6 months of continuous offensive operations and had not been turned back from a single major engagement. Off the Malayan coast in December of 41, Japanese naval aircraft had sunk the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse in under 2 hours, the first capital ships ever sunk by air attack while in full combat maneuver on the open sea. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May of 42, the American carrier Lexington had been sunk and the Yorktown had taken a 500-pound bomb hit that Japanese naval intelligence assessed as requiring a minimum of 3 months of yard time to correct. If that assessment was correct, Nimitz could put only 2 operational carriers at sea against whatever Yamamoto brought. For Operation MI, Yamamoto assembled a force that stretched across hundreds of miles of the Central Pacific in multiple coordinated task forces. The carrier striking force, designated the Kido Butai and placed under Vice Admiral Chester Nimitz, consisted of 4 fleet carriers: the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu. Together, they carried approximately 248 aircraft, and the pilots who could fly them to a standard that no other naval air force in the world had yet matched. The men flying from those decks had been selected through a process of rigorous elimination and trained across years of progressive operational experience, from biplane trainers over China to fleet operations across the Pacific. The Japanese naval aviation training philosophy was explicit about what it was building. A small cadre of men developed to the absolute limit of what the craft demanded, not a mass of interchangeable pilots produced on a schedule. The system graduated its product slowly, at a rate determined by the supply of men who could survive the selection, not by the urgency of the war consuming them. What this meant in practical terms was that each pilot lost was a loss that took years to accumulate and could not be replaced in months. The Japanese Navy accepted this as a condition of the system it had chosen because the system had worked. It had given Japan the finest carrier aviation force in the world in 1941 and 1942. The philosophy was that a man developed to the necessary standard would simply not be hit. And for 2 years and across 2 oceans, that philosophy had held. Line east of Pearl Harbor to detect any American carrier movement. The plan was an elaborate, meticulously coordinated structure whose moving parts spanned thousands of miles of ocean. It accounted for nearly every contingency the combined fleet staff could model. The one contingency it did not seriously entertain was that the Americans knew it was coming. Japanese naval intelligence provided Yamamoto with an assessment of American carrier strength and readiness that gave him specific comfort on this point. The Pacific Fleet's remaining carriers, the estimates said, were likely in the South Pacific following the Coral Sea engagement. The Yorktown was in dry dock with a repair schedule measured in months. The Enterprise and the Hornet might be located and positioned for a reaction once Midway fell, but they would arrive late, without the element of surprise, against a Japanese force that was already established and ready to receive them. The combined fleet staff war-gamed the Midway operation in May of '42, a tabletop exercise held aboard the Yamato, in which a staff officer playing the role of American Air Commander managed to sink 2 Japanese carriers with dive bombers. The umpires overruled the result, ruling that the American attack had been improperly calculated and should have been defeated by Japanese combat air patrol. The exercise continued with 2 Japanese carriers still afloat. The outcome of the war game confirmed what the planners already believed. It did not account for the man working in the basement. Commander Joseph Rochefort ran Station HYPO beneath the 14th Naval District Headquarters building at Pearl Harbor. In a basement workspace his own team had named the dungeon for its heat, its inadequate ventilation, and the total absence of natural light. Rochefort was not a conventional naval officer. He worked without regular hours, appeared in uniform at his own pace, and ran his team by a combination of intellectual authority and personal presence that sat outside the normal chain of command. What he and his cryptanalysts, linguists, and traffic analysts had been building against Jan 25, the Japanese Navy's primary operational cipher, was not a clean cryptographic break. Jan 25 was a complex system that had not been fully penetrated. What the Station HYPO team had assembled through traffic analysis, frequency patterns, the reconstruction of vocabulary from context, and the identification of recurring operational phrases was something that fell short of complete decryption and far exceeded ignorance. The picture forming in Rochefort's basement said that a large Japanese operation was in its final planning phase. The target was being designated in the traffic as AF. The timing fell in the first week of June. The approach vector was from the northwest. The force commitment was consistent with a major carrier operation. Rochefort believed AF was Midway. Washington's codebreaking office, OP-20G, disputed this with the weight of institutional authority behind it. Their analysts drew on the same intercept traffic and reached different conclusions, identifying alternative targets, including the Aleutian Islands, the West Coast, and positions in the South Pacific. The disagreement was not abstract. It determined whether Nimitz would commit his carrier force northwest and fight, or hold his ships back against the possibility of strike elsewhere, leaving Midway to fall without any fleet to contest it. To close the question, Rochefort proposed a ruse so simple it was almost provocative. He had the Midway garrison transmit, in plain language on an open channel, a message reporting that the island's freshwater distillation equipment had broken down and Midway was running short of drinking water. Not in code. In the clear, where any Japanese intelligence officer monitoring American frequencies could read it without effort. 48 hours later, Japanese naval intelligence traffic reported that AF was suffering a water shortage and would require resupply vessels. The target was Midway. Rochefort brought the completed intelligence estimate to Nimitz. The Kido Butai would approach from the northwest. The attack on Midway would open the operation. The date fell on the first days of June, 1942. Nimitz had, at best, 3 weeks. The doubters at Pacific Fleet headquarters had not misread the arithmetic, and they were not wrong to be uncertain. When senior staff officers reviewed what Nimitz was contemplating, the force comparison was not in his favor on any measure. The Japanese fleet assembled for operation, MI numbered over 150 ships in multiple formations spread across thousands of miles of ocean. The Kido Butai's 4 fleet carriers represented the most experienced naval air force on the planet, with a combat record that ran unbroken from Pearl Harbor through Ceylon. Against all of it, Nimitz held the Enterprise and the Hornet, and the Yorktown if the Pearl Harbor yard workers could perform a near-impossible repair in 3 days. Within headquarters, officers raised the possibility that the entire intelligence picture was fabricated, a deliberate Japanese deception designed to draw the American carriers north, while the real blow fell somewhere undefended. The risk of being wrong in that analysis was absolute and irreversible. There was no reserve behind the 3 carriers, no additional fleet, no strategic depth. If the carriers went to Midway on the strength of a deception and Japan struck elsewhere, the Pacific Fleet would have spent itself protecting an empty ocean while the coast lay open. Admiral Ernest King in Washington followed the debate by dispatch from his Navy Department office. In a written assessment composed after the battle, he described the decision Nimitz made in late May of '42 as the most consequential operational gamble of the Pacific War's first year. A full commitment to an intercept based on an incomplete cipher break, confirmed by a message sent deliberately in the open on an unencrypted channel. Nimitz committed. He called Rochefort's estimate a priceless advantage and signed the deployment orders the same day. Task Force 16, built around the Enterprise and the Hornet, was given to Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had taken the command only 5 days earlier when William Halsey was hospitalized with a skin condition severe enough to ground him. Behind the carriers in the operational order of battle came a second force built around battleships and cruisers, positioned to close on the American carriers once Nagumo's air groups had located and engaged them. A separate invasion force carrying troops, vehicles, and construction equipment for the occupation of Midway followed on its own route. Submarines were deployed in a picket line east of Pearl Harbor to detect any American carrier movement. The plan was an elaborate, meticulously coordinated structure whose moving parts spanned thousands of miles of ocean. It accounted for nearly every contingency the combined fleet staff could model. The one contingency it did not seriously entertain was that the Americans knew it was coming. Japanese naval intelligence provided Yamamoto with an assessment of American carrier strength and readiness that gave him specific comfort on this point. The Pacific Fleet's remaining carriers, the estimate said, were likely in the South Pacific following the Coral Sea engagement. The Yorktown was in dry dock with a repair schedule measured in months. The Enterprise and the Hornet might be located in position for a reaction once Midway fell, but they would arrive late, without the element of surprise, against a Japanese force that was already established and ready to receive them. The combined fleet staff war-gamed the Midway operation in May of '42, a tabletop exercise held aboard the Yamato, in which a staff officer playing the role of American Air Commander managed to sink 2 Japanese carriers with dive bombers. The umpires overruled the result, ruling that the American attack had been improperly calculated and should have been defeated by Japanese combat air patrol. The exercise continued with 2 Japanese carriers still afloat. The outcome of the war game confirmed what the planners already believed. It did not account for the man working in the basement. Commander Joseph Rochefort ran Station HYPO beneath the 14th Naval District Headquarters building at Pearl Harbor, In a basement workspace his own team had named the dungeon for its heat, its inadequate ventilation, and the total absence of natural light. Rochefort was not a conventional naval officer. He worked without regular hours, appeared in uniform at his own pace, and ran his team by a combination of intellectual authority and personal presence that sat outside the normal chain of command. What he and his cryptanalysts, linguists, and traffic analysts had been building against Jan 25, the Japanese Navy's primary operational cipher, was not a clean cryptographic break. Jan 25 was a complex system that had not been fully penetrated. What the Station HYPO team had assembled through traffic analysis, frequency patterns, the reconstruction of vocabulary from context, and the identification of recurring operational phrases was something that fell short of complete decryption and far exceeded ignorance. The picture forming in Rochefort's basement said that a large Japanese operation was in its final planning phase. The target was being designated in the traffic as AF. The timing fell in the first week of June. The approach vector was from the northwest. The force commitment was consistent with a major carrier operation. Rochefort believed AF was Midway. Washington's codebreaking office, OP-20G, disputed this with the weight of institutional authority behind it. Their analysts drew on the same intercept traffic and reached different conclusions, identifying alternative targets, including the Aleutian Islands, the West Coast, and positions in the South Pacific. The disagreement was not abstract. It determined whether Nimitz would commit his carrier force northwest and fight, or hold his ships back against the possibility of a strike elsewhere, leaving Midway to fall without any fleet to contest it. To close the question, Rochefort proposed a ruse so simple it was almost provocative. He had the Midway garrison transmit, in plain language on an open channel, a message reporting that the island's freshwater distillation equipment had broken down and Midway was running short of drinking water. Not in code. In the clear, where any Japanese intelligence officer monitoring American frequencies could read it without effort. 48 hours later, Japanese naval intelligence traffic reported that AF was suffering a water shortage and would require resupply vessels. The target was Midway. Rochefort brought the completed intelligence estimate to Nimitz. The Kido Butai would approach from the northwest. The attack on Midway would open the operation. The date fell in the first days of June, 1942. Nimitz had, at best, 3 weeks. The doubters at Pacific Fleet headquarters had not misread the arithmetic, and they were not wrong to be uncertain. When senior staff officers reviewed what Nimitz was contemplating, the force comparison was not in his favor on any measure. The Japanese fleet assembled for Operation MI numbered over 150 ships in multiple formations spread across thousands of miles of ocean. The Kido Butai's 4 fleet carriers represented the most experienced naval air force on the planet, with a combat record that ran unbroken from Pearl Harbor through Ceylon. Against all of it, Nimitz held the Enterprise and the Hornet, and the Yorktown if the Pearl Harbor yard workers could perform a near-impossible repair in 3 days. Within headquarters, officers raised the possibility that the entire intelligence picture was fabricated, a deliberate Japanese deception designed to draw the American carriers north, while the real blow fell somewhere undefended. The risk of being wrong in that analysis was absolute and irreversible. There was no reserve behind the 3 carriers, no additional fleet, no strategic depth. If the carriers went to Midway on the strength of a deception and Japan struck elsewhere, the Pacific Fleet would have spent itself protecting an empty ocean while the coast lay open. Admiral Ernest King in Washington followed the debate by dispatch from his Navy Department office. In a written assessment composed after the battle, he described the decision Nimitz made in late May of '42 as the most consequential operational gamble of the Pacific War's first year. A full commitment to an intercept based on an incomplete cipher break, confirmed by a message sent deliberately in the open on an unencrypted channel. Nimitz committed. He called Rochefort's estimate a priceless advantage and signed the deployment orders the same day. Task Force 16, built around the Enterprise and the Hornet, was given to Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had taken the command only 5 days earlier when William Halsey was hospitalized with a skin condition severe enough to ground him. Spruance was a surface warfare officer, a cruiser division commander with no previous experience leading a carrier task force in a combat. He took the assignment, studied the intelligence brief, asked his questions, and raised no objection to the operational plan. Task Force 16 left Pearl Harbor on May 28th. The Yorktown was still in dry dock. The Navy Yard survey of her damage, completed when she limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27th, estimated her repair time at a minimum of 90 days. Nimitz walked through her damaged interior the following morning with the repair superintendent alongside him. Moving through injured compartments, looking at cracked frames and buckled plating, and the places where the bomb's energy had traveled through structure that had not been built to absorb it. He told the superintendent he needed the ship in 3 days. 1,400 workers went into the Yorktown on rotating shifts running through 3 days and 2 nights without interruption. They patched bulkheads with new steel. They rerouted electrical systems around the sections that could not be addressed in the time available. They restored the aviation fuel systems, the arresting gear, the catapults, the essential machinery of a carrier that needed to fight rather than a carrier that needed to be fully whole. The Yorktown left Pearl Harbor dry dock on May 29th with repair workers still finishing work in her lower spaces. They transferred to a tender by small boat at sea. On May 31st, Nimitz gave Fletcher and Spruance their final operational orders. The intelligence picture said Nagumo would approach from the northwest, believing the American carriers were either absent or reacting in transit to news of his opening attack on Midway. He would not be looking northeast. Nimitz designated a holding position 225 miles northeast of Midway as Point Luck, a name that required no further explanation. The carriers would wait at that position until Nagumo committed his strike force to the Midway attack. Then, while Japanese decks were being turned and rearmed and the combat air patrol was managing the island's air defenses, the American carriers would attack from a direction the Japanese operational plan had not accounted for. Task Force 17, built around the Yorktown, sailed May 30th. The 2 task forces joined at Point Luck on June 2nd. The date Rochefort's estimate had assigned to the Japanese attack on Midway was June 4th. June 3rd, 1942. A Navy Catalina patrol aircraft flying out of Midway on its morning search arc made contact with the Japanese invasion convoy 700 miles to the southwest, a long column of transports and escorts moving at the pace of the slowest ship in the formation. The sighting confirmed that the intelligence picture had been accurate within 48 hours and less than 100 miles. It was the kind of accuracy that justified the decision Nimitz had made. Army Air Force's B-17 Flying Fortresses attacked the convoy from high altitude that afternoon and returned with reports of hits. Japanese records compiled after the war recorded no hits. High-altitude level bombing against maneuvering ships at sea was a proposition that the entire Pacific War would demonstrate repeatedly to be functionally futile. The geometry of falling ordnance against a moving target at 40,000 feet, making the probability of contact vanishingly small regardless of the number of bombs released. But the contact told Fletcher and Spruance what they needed. The invasion force was on schedule. The carriers were close. Nagumo's Kido Butai was moving through broken overcast approximately 600 miles to the northwest of Midway, maintaining radio silence through the approach, invisible to American patrol aircraft, still entirely unaware of anything waiting in the ocean to his northeast. His submarines had been deployed to watch the sea lanes east of Pearl Harbor and report any American carrier movement from the base. They had established their picket line on June 1st. Task Forces 16 and 17 had passed through that same water 4 days before the submarines arrived. The American carriers were already at Point Luck when the Japanese screen was laid. The intelligence architecture Nagumo was relying on to protect his surprise had failed at the foundation before his fleet ever left home waters. At 5:30 in the morning on June 4th, Nagumo launched his opening strike against Midway. 108 aircraft drawn from all 4 carriers, organized into waves of horizontal bombers, dive bombers, and Zero fighter escort. Midway's air search radar detected the incoming formation at approximately 140 miles. The island's fighters scrambled. What followed over Midway's lagoon was close to a one-sided destruction. The garrison had received reinforcements in the weeks before the attack, including Marine Corps Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats, Army Air Force's P-40s, and B-26s that had been sent to strengthen the defenses. The Brewster Buffalo had been identified by every experienced pilot who flew it as a machine that could not be taken against a Zero with any reasonable expectation of survival. Captain Philip White, who survived the interception, wrote in his after-action report that a pilot sent into combat in a Brewster Buffalo should consider himself murdered before he takes off. They attacked regardless. Of 25 Marine fighters launched against the incoming strike, 17 were shot down before they could drive the Japanese formation off its approach. The survivors returned with aircraft damaged enough that several could not be flown again. The Japanese strike damaged Midway's facilities seriously. The fuel storage area was hit. The command post took direct damage. The seaplane hangar burned. When Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had led the attack, broke off and turned back toward the carriers at the end of the strike run, he transmitted a report to Nagumo. The island required a second strike. Midway's ground defenses, its anti-aircraft batteries, and its runway remained operational. If the invasion force was going to put troops ashore, the island needed to be hit again before it could. While Tominaga was forming up for the return flight, the island was already fighting back. Between approximately 7:15 and 800 in the morning, successive waves of Midway-based aircraft attacked the Kido Butai in strikes that the Japanese Combat Air Patrol and anti-aircraft fire tore apart one by one. 6 Navy TBF Avengers from Torpedo Squadron 8's shore detachment attacked, and lost 5 of their 6 aircraft without scoring a hit. 4 Army Air Force's B-26 Marauders attacked with torpedoes and lost 2 aircraft. One Japanese eyewitness account, recording that a burning B-26 flew directly at the Akagi's bridge before its pilot brought it down, just short of the ship. 16 Marine Corps SBD Dauntless and Vindicator dive bombers attacked next, and lost 6 aircraft and damaged none of the carriers. 15 B-17 Flying Fortresses dropped bombs from high altitude, as they had against the invasion convoy the previous day, and produced the same result as the previous day. The shore-based attacks cost Midway heavily in aircraft and crews. They did not damage a single Japanese carrier, but they kept Nagumo's Combat Air Patrol engaged and his anti-aircraft crews at their guns through the morning, and they contributed to the sense of continuous threat that shaped every decision made on the Akagi's bridge. That message from Tominaga arrived on the Akagi at 7:15 in the morning, and the decision it produced in Nagumo's operations room was the hinge on which the entire day turned. Nagumo had held his second wave on the flight decks of all 4 carriers in anti-ship configuration, aircraft loaded with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, the correct ordnance for use against warships. Tominaga's recommendation required switching all of that to conventional land bombs for a second Midway strike. Nagumo ordered the rearming to begin. In the hangar bays below the flight decks of the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, ordnance handlers began removing torpedoes and anti-ship bombs from fueled aircraft and breaking out conventional ordnance from the stowage racks. The process was underway when, at 7:28, a report arrived from a scout aircraft off the cruiser Tone. The Tone scout had launched late due to a catapult malfunction and had only recently reached its assigned search sector. It had found surface ships to the northeast. 10 ships. No carrier identified. Nagumo waited. At 8:09, the same scout sent an update. A cruiser type was visible in the group. Still no carrier. At 8:20, the transmission that changed everything. There was a carrier in the formation to the northeast. The rearming order reversed immediately. The conventional bombs being loaded on an aircraft in place of torpedoes were now to be removed, and the anti-ship ordnance reloaded. On the hangar decks of all 4 carriers, ordnance handlers were moving weapons for the second time in under an hour through spaces crowded with fueled aircraft and servicing equipment, under time pressure that was pushing the handling beyond safe procedure. The bombs that should have been struck properly below to the armored magazines were being set aside against bulkheads and stacked wherever there was floor space, in compartments not designed to contain the explosions they contained. Before the rearming could be completed and a strike launched, the Americans arrived. Between approximately 7:45 and 9:45 that morning, 3 American torpedo bomber squadrons attacked the Kido Butai in separate waves, arriving at different times and from different approach angles, without coordination and without fighter escort. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet reached the carriers first. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron had broken from the planned group approach during the outbound leg and followed his own instinct about where the Japanese fleet had moved. He was correct, and he found the Kido Butai entirely alone, without any other American aircraft near the target. 15 TBD Devastator torpedo planes flew into the Japanese combat air patrol at low altitude and low speed on their attack runs. The Zeros descended immediately. All 15 aircraft were shot down. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor, was knocked into the ocean short of his target. He found a seat cushion from his wrecked aircraft, pushed it just below the surface above his head to conceal himself from Japanese fighters working over the wreckage, and spent the rest of the day floating under that cushion, watching the battle unfold above and around him. Not one torpedo from Torpedo Squadron 8 reached a Japanese hull. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise followed. 14 aircraft, 10 shot down before any ordnance could be delivered. No hits. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown arrived last. 10 of 12 aircraft destroyed. The combined loss across all 3 torpedo squadrons was 35 aircraft out of 41 committed, an attrition rate that the record of the Pacific War produced nowhere else at a single engagement, and that produced no material damage to any Japanese vessel. But the Japanese Combat Air Patrol had been fighting for close to 2 hours at low altitude. Their fuel was being consumed at the rate that low-level maneuvering demanded. Their ammunition had been spent in quantity. They were distributed across the water at the level where torpedo planes flew, not at the altitude where dive bombers attacked. The flight decks above them were crowded with aircraft and loose ordnance in a configuration that had been changed twice in under an hour and that had not been made safe. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's far more in the record still to cover. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. At altitude above the cloud layer, Lieutenant Commander Clarence McClusky had been searching for the Japanese fleet for longer than his fuel margin comfortably allowed. He commanded the Enterprise Air Group, 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Bombing Squadron 6 and Scouting Squadron 6 combined. He had flown the outbound leg to the expected intercept coordinates derived from the intelligence picture and found open ocean. The Japanese carriers were not where the flight plan said they would be. The clouds below him showed nothing but empty water. The decision McClusky faced at that moment was not complicated to state, but the weight of it was genuine. He could turn back to the Enterprise with a full bomb load and not enough fuel to search broadly. He could fly an expanding pattern and hope to cover the right sector before his gauges forced him home. He turned north. His reasoning was that if Nagumo had maneuvered to close on the reported American contact to the northeast, the fleet would have moved north and east from its last charted position. McClusky began a northeasterly search. Below him, the Japanese destroyer Airshire was running at high speed northeast, throwing a white wake across flat water. She had been holding the American submarine Nautilus under with depth charges and was now racing to rejoin the Kido Butai, making full speed back to the formation. McClusky saw the wake from altitude, a single white line cut across the surface of the ocean, pointing northeast, pointing toward whatever the destroyer was heading back to. He turned onto the heading the wake gave him and held it. He found the Japanese fleet. What McClusky saw when the clouds broke and the formation spread below him was 4 carriers in a roughly rectangular disposition, with a screen of cruisers and destroyers around them, their wakes still churning from the constant maneuvering they had been doing while the morning's attacks came in. Columns of smoke rose from the area of the Kido Butai, where Midway's shore-based attackers had been beaten off, not from carrier damage, but from ships that had been firing their anti-aircraft batteries throughout the morning and from the aircraft debris falling around the formation. The flight decks of the carriers below were crowded with aircraft, and even from altitude it was possible to see the activity on those decks as the rearming continued. At approximately 10:20 in the morning, McClusky's dive bombers rolled over and began their attack dives from 17,000 feet. At nearly the same moment, and from a different approach, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie had led Bombing Squadron 3 from the Yorktown to the same area, the 2 groups arriving over different targets within minutes of each other, without radio coordination between them, driven to the same piece of ocean by separate navigation decisions that resolved, in the space of 5 minutes, into the most consequential attack of the Pacific War. McClusky split his attack between the Akagi and the Kaga. A section led by Lieutenant Richard Best went for Nagumo's flagship. Leslie put his Yorktown bombers against the Soryu. The pilots pushed into 70-degree attack dives and came down fast. The Zeros fighting below the cloud deck had neither the altitude nor the speed to climb into a high-angle interception of aircraft already in their runs. The anti-aircraft gun crews on the carrier decks had spent 2 hours tracking low-altitude torpedo planes and had not adjusted their solutions for steep overhead attack angles. The window that the torpedo squadrons had opened with their lives was still open, and now the dive bombers were coming through it. 3 bombs struck the Kaga. The first hit the forward elevator area and drove down through the deck into the hangar, where fueled aircraft and ordnance were packed in exactly the configuration that the interrupted rearming had left them. The second hit amidships, opening compartments that fed the fires already burning from the first impact. The third landed near the bridge and killed the captain where he stood. The fires that broke out in the Kaga could not be stopped because what was burning was distributed throughout the hangar in the form of aviation fuel and aircraft tanks, and weapons left in the open, feeding secondary explosions that the damage control parties could locate, but not reach before they detonated. Richard Best put 2 bombs on the Akagi. The first struck the center of the flight deck and drove into the hangar, where a row of strike aircraft sat fueled and loaded for the attack Nagumo had been trying to launch since 8:20. The detonation set off a chain of secondary explosions that ran through the hangar in both directions from the impact point. The second bomb hit aft. The Akagi's fires spread faster than her crew could organize against them, fed by the same internal conditions that had killed the Kaga. On the Soryu, 3 bombs from Leslie's group struck in a spread across the flight deck and upper hangar. The result was the same fires, the same secondary explosions, the same conditions that neither time nor personnel could organize against before they became irreversible. The Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu were all mortally struck within a window of approximately 5 minutes. Nagumo transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara by small boat. The Akagi's fires already passed the point where her crew could organize against them. The carrier burned through the afternoon and was ordered abandoned late in the day. She sank the following morning. The Kaga's fires reached beyond control almost from the moment of the hits. She sank that afternoon with a loss of over 800 men. The Soryu went down before either of them, 3 major internal explosions driving through her hull in rapid succession. Her captain, Ryosuke Yamamoto, declined to leave the ship. He was last seen on the bridge, sword drawn, as the carrier went under. 3 of the 4 fleet carriers of the Kido Butai were burning debris on the Pacific surface by 10:30 in the morning. The Hiryu remained. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the Hiryu and watching the smoke columns rise from 3 of his sister ships across the water, did not pause. He launched within minutes. Later assessments of his decision describe it as the only rational response available to a Japanese commander in his position. Waiting was not an option the situation offered. If the Hiryu was going to do anything before she was found and hit, as the other 3 had been, she had to strike before the Americans could locate her. Yamaguchi knew what the morning had cost. He also understood that the Americans' carriers were somewhere in the same ocean, and that the intelligence picture could no longer be relied upon to tell him where. He launched what he had, without time to fully brief the strike or coordinate a multi-layer attack. Speed was the only advantage the Hiryu had left. Lieutenant Tomonaga, who had led the opening Midway strike before dawn, and whose aircraft had taken a hit in the fuel tank during that mission, climbed back into his cockpit to lead the first attack wave, knowing the tank would not carry him home. His aircraft had taken more fuel than would return him. He flew anyway. 18 dive bombers with 6 Zero escorts. Tomonaga flew toward the American carriers and did not come back. American combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire from the task force destroyed most of the Hiryu's first strike wave before it reached the carriers. 5 dive bombers broke through. 3 bombs struck the Yorktown. The first hit near the number 1 elevator and started fires in the forward hangar. The second penetrated through the deck into the carrier's uptakes and extinguished 5 of the 6 boilers, stopping the ship dead in the water. The third exploded near the base of the island structure. The Yorktown's damage control parties worked at the rate their training had made automatic, and within approximately an hour the ship was moving again at 20 knots, her fires apparently under control. The Hiryu's torpedo planes found her before she could clear the area. 10 aircraft arrived at low altitude while the carrier was still working to rebuild speed and restore her defensive formation. 2 torpedoes hit the Yorktown on her port side. The flooding drove a list that the pumps could not reverse. Fletcher transferred his flag to the cruiser Astoria, passed operational command of both task forces to Spruance, and the order to abandon ship was given late in the afternoon. The Yorktown remained afloat, listing heavily, her engineering spaces and lower decks flooded, but her hull not yet broken. A Yorktown scout plane had followed the Hiryu's attacking aircraft back to their source before the damage became critical. The contact report went to Spruance at 3:30 in the afternoon, and he launched a strike from the Enterprise immediately. 24 Dauntless dive bombers carrying the same ordnance, and the same pilots who had attacked in the morning. The Hiryu was turning into the wind to launch her remaining aircraft when the dive bombers arrived overhead. 4 bombs hit the Hiryu's flight deck in a concentrated pattern. The fires that followed told the same story they had told 3 times already that morning, and they were no more controllable in the 4th carrier than they had been in the first 3. The Hiryu burned through the night of June 4th. She sank at 9:03 on the morning of June 5th. Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship alongside the Hiryu's captain. Yamamoto, riding far to the rear aboard the Yamato with a surface force that had never come within range of the battle, received the reports through the afternoon in a sequence that grew progressively worse, and that could not be reconciled with the operational plan he had approved. He issued orders attempting to concentrate his surviving battleships and cruisers for a night surface engagement, still seeking a way to force a conclusion on terms where his gunships could decide it. Spruance, who had been briefed specifically on the possibility of Japanese night attack using superior surface firepower, pulled both task forces east after dark and declined the engagement. In the early hours of June 5th, Yamamoto canceled the night operation and ordered the fleet to retire from the area. The invasion of Midway was abandoned. The retirement order was transmitted in silence. There was no attempt by the combined fleet staff to immediately frame what had happened in the context of broader strategic operations. No reassessment circulated to theater commanders. No accounting sent to Tokyo that evening of what 4 carriers and their air groups had cost. The formal operational order simply directed the fleet to withdraw. What the staff knew, and what Yamamoto knew as the Yamato, turned away from the waters northwest of Midway, was that the instrument that had been the engine of Japanese offensive power since December of 41 had ceased to exist. The 4 carriers were not damaged. They were gone. The air groups aboard them were not depleted. They were destroyed. The submarines, the battleships, the cruisers, and the destroyers that remained were weapons without an offensive framework to operate within, powerful in isolation and useless for the purpose the operation had been designed to serve. Japan would spend the remainder of the Pacific War on the strategic defensive, reacting to American moves rather than dictating its own, fighting to hold what it had rather than reaching for what Yamamoto had believed was within grasp. The offensive that was supposed to end the Pacific War in the summer of 1942 ended instead in the dark waters northwest of Midway, attended by no ceremony and no announcement. The Yorktown did not sink with the rest. She drifted, badly damaged but above the surface, through June 5th. A salvage party went back aboard on June 6th and found her fires out, her hull stable enough to be towed. The destroyer Hammond came alongside to provide pumping power. The Japanese submarine I-168, assigned to confirm the destruction of the American carriers, found a Yorktown through her periscope that afternoon. 3 torpedoes. 2 struck the Yorktown, and 2 struck the Hammond alongside her. The Hammond sank in 4 minutes, taking 80 men with her. The Yorktown sank the following morning, June 7th, at 5:01. The balance sheet drawn from the battle's records showed an outcome the force comparison had not predicted. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, all 4 of them veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack, in less than 24 hours of combat. The Kido Butai that had been the engine of Japanese naval power from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean did not exist as a fighting formation after June 4th, 1942. Approximately 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen were dead. Roughly 250 aircraft had been destroyed in combat or lost with the burning carriers. The material losses could be placed in columns. What could not be replaced with a production schedule was the men inside those burned hulls. The Japanese naval aviation training system had been built on a philosophy that accepted slow production if the product was exceptional. The pilots who flew from Nagumo's carriers at Midway had accumulated their skills across years of progressive operational experience, moving from trainers over Japan to combat over China to fleet operations spanning the full breadth of the Pacific. The system that produced them graduated its men slowly and at a rate determined by the supply of candidates who could survive the selection process, not by the urgency of the war consuming them. Each loss was measured in years, not weeks. The senior petty officers and warrant officers who formed the backbone of Japanese carrier aviation, whose experience ran to hundreds of combat hours, whose instincts had been refined across years of actual engagement, died in the hangar fires of 4 carriers or were shot from the air during the torpedo attacks that preceded the dive bombers. The Japanese Navy recognized the severity of this loss and attempted to accelerate the replacement pipeline. The attempts confirmed what the system had always been designed to prevent. Training times were shortened. Standards were adjusted. The pipeline produced more pilots per month and produced them demonstrably less capable. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, the 2 years of attrition that had begun at Midway expressed itself in a single day. Japanese carrier air groups attacking the American Fifth Fleet lost 346 aircraft. American losses were 29. The American pilots who did the killing that day had been trained by the same industrial machinery that had produced the Hellcat squadrons. The Japanese pilots they faced had been trained by a system scrambling to fill a void it had never designed to fill. The men who flew over Midway in June of 42 were not replaced, because the system that made them could not be sped up without making something else entirely. The American pilot training pipeline that had been expanding since 1940 was a different architecture. Its product at Midway was not uniformly experienced. Many of the Torpedo squadron aviators were flying their first combat missions. But the system behind them was scaling in ways that Japanese planners had not modeled with accuracy, and it absorbed the losses Midway caused without breaking. What it did at Midway was open the window. What it did afterward was send through the window a generation of pilots who would finish what the torpedo bombers had started. Nimitz understood what the battle records showed. He said later, without qualification, that at Midway the Japanese lost the war. Whether that precise claim survives the scrutiny of the 3 years that followed depends on where one draws the line. What survives without dispute is this. The carrier striking force that had been the instrument of Japanese expansion from December of 41 to June of 42 did not exist after June of 42. The capacity to hold the strategic initiative in the Pacific did not survive the morning of June 4th either. The individuals who had assembled the outcome at different distances from the actual combat ended the battle at different distances from recognition. Rochefort, whose intelligence work made Nimitz's gamble rational rather than merely desperate, was removed from Station HYPO in October of 1942. The internal dispute between his team and Washington's codebreaking office, OP-20G, had never been formally resolved, and the institutional dynamics of the Navy's intelligence apparatus did not settle in his favor once the victory was secure. He was assigned to a posting with nothing to do with cryptanalysis and remained there for the rest of the war. His contribution to the Battle of Midway was not officially recognized by the Navy until 1985, when the Secretary of the Navy awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal in a posthumous ceremony. Joseph Rochefort died in July of 1976. 9 years before the service acknowledged what he had done. McClusky was awarded the Navy Cross. He was also wounded during his pull-out from the Kaga dive, a Zero's cannon round striking his hand, and he flew the return trip to the Enterprise holding the controls of a Dauntless with an injury that would require surgery when he landed. He served the remainder of the war in progressively senior aviation billets and retired as a Rear Admiral in 1956. He died in June of 1976. George Gay was pulled from the ocean the morning after the battle by a Navy Catalina patrol aircraft, alive and substantially uninjured after more than 24 hours floating under a seat cushion while the decisive naval engagement of the Pacific War's first phase was fought around him. He flew for the rest of the war. He flew commercial airline routes for decades after it. He gave testimony about what Torpedo Squadron 8 had done and what it had cost in interviews and in a memoir published in 1979 with the consistency and the detail of a man who had been given a front-row view of something that history would need to understand. He died in October of 1994. Yamamoto survived the battle he had designed by less than a year. In April of 1943, American P-38 fighters intercepted the transport aircraft, carrying him on an inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. His itinerary had been transmitted in Japanese naval codes that American intelligence had read. The aircraft was shot down over Bougainville. Yamamoto was 60 years old. Nagumo survived long enough to command the naval defense of Saipan in July of 1944, where, as American forces overran the island's defenses, he died by his own hand. The physical wrecks of what happened in the waters northwest of Midway Atoll accumulated as evidence at the bottom of the Pacific across the decades that followed the battle. In October of 1999, a joint oceanographic expedition led by Robert Ballard located the Yorktown on the Pacific floor at a depth of approximately 3 miles. She was found sitting substantially intact, upright on the bottom, her gun mounts still trained in the positions her crew had left them when the abandoned ship order came. Ballard said later that she looked as though she had just been vacated. The wreck of the Akagi was located in October of 2019 by a research expedition organized under the late Paul Allen's Vulcan Incorporated. She was found at approximately 18,000 feet, her hull separated from the remains of her deck structure, resting in water that no Japanese operational planner of the spring of '42 had imagined she would enter. What survives of her at that depth is consistent with what the battle reports describe. A ship destroyed from within, her interior spaces consumed by fires that began in the fuel and ordnance that the rearming order had left distributed through her hangar deck when the first bomb came through. The physical evidence of a wreck at 18,000 feet is necessarily incomplete, but the distribution of debris on the ocean floor tells a story that aligns with every account that came back from the battle. The Kaga and the Soryu have since been located in the same general area of ocean floor, roughly where the battle reports from June 4th placed them. In the decades after the battle, Nimitz was asked on several occasions what he believed had determined the outcome at Midway. The answer he gave most consistently was that the battle had come down to a matter of 5 minutes. He meant the interval from McClusky's first bomb hit on the Kaga to the last bomb striking the Soryu, the window in which 3 Japanese fleet carriers went from ready to launch their strike to burning past any possibility of recovery. 5 minutes assembled from 6 months of intelligence work done in a basement without windows, from a ruse built on an unencrypted radio message about a broken water distillation pipe, from repair workers who drove new steel into a damaged carrier for 72 hours without stopping, from torpedo bomber pilots who flew into a prepared defense at low altitude and low speed without fighter cover and flew it knowing what the arithmetic said about their chances, and from a navigation decision made above empty ocean by a commander who turned north on a calculation and found a carrier fleet by following a destroyer's wake. Yamamoto had committed the most powerful naval concentration in the Pacific to destroy the last American carriers standing between Japan and unchallenged domination of the ocean. He had brought the finest carrier air force in the world and the fleet that had given Japan 6 months of unbroken advance across half the Pacific. He had designed a trap built on the assumption that the man sitting across from him was uninformed, outmatched, and reactive, because no other assumption was consistent with the intelligence his apparatus had provided. The assumption had a name. The name was Nimitz. The intelligence apparatus had been wrong. Rochefort had been right. Nimitz had trusted him. In 5 minutes on the morning of June 4th, 1942, 3,000 feet above the surface of the Central Pacific, the calculation that had driven every Japanese decision since December 7th of '41 ran out of room. The sentry held. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.